Solutions. Seema has been specialising in pharmacovigilance for 20 years and has headed up global medical affairs and has been the final ABPI signatory for many large organisations for setting up SJ Solutions. SJ Solutions services both consulting and contracting to provide solutions to drug safety, research and other affairs related to the running of a business within the pharmaceuticals industry. Over to you.
Okay, brilliant. I hope you can all hear me okay. I'm going to talk about literature, kind of review, monitoring, etc., especially given that we've had the new changes with the EMA coming on board just recently with their requirements. So just to start off, I thought it would be worthwhile just to look at the EU requirements. So these are really where the references for literature and what you're supposed to do. We have the directive, obviously, the regulation, implementing regulation, and then the modules are GVP Module 6, 7 and 9. And we'll certainly cover GVP Module 6 in quite a bit of detail because that's where there is a very specific appendix with a lot of detail about what you should be doing with regard to your literature searching and monitoring. So Module 6, as you know, it's ICSRs, Module 7, PSURs, and Module 9 is signal management. So if we look at the objectives overall, what is it that we're trying to achieve? So there's a clear understanding that the literature really is a significant source of safety information and does need to be monitored and reviewed on a regular basis to look for information that will help you in monitoring your benefit-risk balance, also with regards to signal detection and help you with your activities related to that, and also to assess emerging safety issues because sometimes these things do come through the literature and they are picked up through the literature and analysis of this. I wanted to start with really Module 6, ICSRs, and I mean the reason for this is because there's so much information in Module 6. As I was saying, there is an appendix, Appendix 2, and that details exactly what is needed. Now, Module 6 does state that the scientific and medical literature is a significant source of safety information, and you do need to maintain awareness of publications related to safety. The marketing authorization holder is required to do that. And they need to do this through systematic literature review of widely used reference database. It says database, but examples that are given are Medline, Embase, Excerpta Medica. Now, this review needs to be done no less frequently than once a week, so at least once a week. And you do also need to review the literature in the period between your submission of your marketing authorization or to your MAA and the granting of that authorization to look for changes to benefit risk. So you are required to ensure that you do monitor the literature in that time period. If you have a marketing authorization, so say if your product's been suspended or for some reason you aren't actually marketing, you are still required to search the literature and you will need to do your literature searching on at least a weekly basis. Now, I've mentioned here at the bottom that the European Medicines Agency will take over the ICSR literature review. That has happened over the last few months, and at the end we'll come to that in a bit more detail. So the next thing that I wanted to touch on is your day zero. And your day zero is the date that the organization becomes aware of a publication which contains a minimum information, i.e. a valid report, really, for a case. So you need to have your patient, your reporter, your event, your product. And that can be the date of the search itself, if you have enough information within the abstract, or you may need to retrieve the full article, and it will be then the date that you received that full article. But it's important that you don't have, significant delay between saying, right, yes, actually, I need to retrieve this article because there may be a valid ICSR, but the abstract doesn't give me enough information, and then, you wait 2 months, 3 months before you get that article. So there should be a mechanism for obtaining those articles promptly so that you can confirm the validity of that case. Okay, moving on. I mean, it's important to know where you're looking with regards to your searches. I mean, we've talked about Medline, Embase, etc., but the recommendation, or what you need to do, is to ensure that you're looking at the database that has the largest reference of articles that's relevant for your product. And that's where you really need to understand your product. You need to understand where you are going to find the most safety information for that. And whilst the well-known databases such as Medline and Embase do cover majority of the scientific and medical journals that are going to be relevant for your product, there may be situations where you need to consider other databases. So if you have a herbal medication, you may need to then look at something that's a bit more specific for herbal medicines. If you have something where there's a safety concern from the non-clinical side, you may need to then look at another database. So I know that companies do tend to use Medline and Embase, and then probably a third one which is a bit more specialized and relevant to their product portfolio. Database providers will be able to let you know or explain to you how the records are categorized, how new the information is, what is the lead time for information to go into the database. For Embase, it's a bit quicker than it is for Medline, and that will make a difference then to what kind of information you're going to retrieve. And they can also advise you on what is included and what's not included. And I think it's really, really important to understand what you are searching in. And we all know with a database, it's all very well looking on a database, but you need to know it inside and out and know what's included, what's not included, and how things are categorized. As I said, you usually have one or more databases for a specific product, and that will just give you, more coverage to ensure that you are retrieving relevant safety information for that product. And you do need to look at published abstracts for meetings and draft manuscripts, posters, etc. And you need to take that into account because these things may not be available on the standard databases, and you might need to go to other sources to be able to retrieve that information. So if we go on to the search construction now. So here there's discussion about recall and precision, and recall is really the number of hits that you get, and precision is how relevant are those hits. And the way that I look at it, it's a bit like sensitivity for your recall and specificity for your precision. And as you probably know, if you have high sensitivity, you'll have lower specificity, and vice versa. So if you wanted the highest recall, what you would do is put in the medicinal product name and the active substance only, and you should then retrieve everything that's relevant or related, certainly, to your product. Really, I mean, if you'd ask the health authority would say, no, no defined acceptable loss of recall for PV is what they're looking for. But we all know that in the real world, that's really not possible, and a balance is required. And that's where then all of the searching terms come in, and these complicated searches that get set up, etc. And what you will need to do is put your search into place and test that search as well to ensure that you're getting a high enough level of recall and precision, and that you're not missing relevant records, but you are reducing the search enough as well to make it manageable. And to do that, as I've said before, you really do need to understand the database, understand how how things are indexed within the database, what their policy is, what synonyms are used, and what words are used as well. Whether it's US English, that kind of thing, those things make a difference. And it's only by knowing the database you'll be able to search properly within the database. And you can really use the expertise of the database provider, who will be able to guide you in the right way as to how to set up your searches in the different types of sources there. Now, if you look at product terms, I've already said we shouldn't be looking at just your brand name. You should look at your active. If your active substance is an index term, it does make it much easier because you can use that then, and then you can do further kind of searching based on their indexing. If, for example, they have adverse events or toxicology or something like that in Medline and Embase, they do, you can then set up your search so it will pull out anything that's relevant to that. but you will need a degree of free text searching as well. You need to look at spellings. You need to make sure that you understand how your product would have been coded into the database so you can pull it out appropriately. If your products, just come out of development or still, part in development in different programs, then you may want to use the number codes as well, because you might not pick it out otherwise, pick out information relevant to that. Looking at the salt or a specific compound that's related, you have to consider whether you would need to put that in specifically to retrieve your relevant articles. And I think, you are able to limit your search, so you can exclude different forms or routes if they're not applicable to your product. But what you need to ensure is that you would pick out where it's not specified. So say if you had an oral formulation and you didn't want all the IV formulations coming back, you may be able to actually limit your search to the oral formulation. But if it didn't state, you would need to ensure that you would retrieve those results and they would be part of your output. You need to ensure that you're retrieving overdose, medication error, etc. And we'll come on to that in a little while. And you shouldn't routinely exclude records of your unbranded products. So where it's not specifically stated, you should ensure that you would retrieve that and you assess them appropriately. And you need to consider whether it's appropriate to include, searches related to the excipient or adjuvant where they may have possible pharmacological effects as well. It may be relevant from a significant safety information perspective. So I just wanted to touch very briefly on some of the deficiencies in search terms. And again, these are stated within Module 6. It's where you've got a search that's not covering all of the areas that it should do. So things like not looking at outcomes such as death. You might have fatal in there, but you've not included death. You've not got pregnancy in there. You're not looking for uneventful pregnancy. So you're missing out these special areas, and you're not able then to retrieve the data that's relevant for these areas and put them into your database so they can go into the PSUR review and also for signal management and ICSRs if appropriate. So asymptomatic overdose, for example, medication error, off-label use, misuse, abuse. So sometimes the search will be set up and it won't include specific terms that will ensure that articles relevant for these areas are picked up and retrieved so they can be assessed appropriately. So when we look at limiting the search, so you can, as we said, limit your search to make sure that it is more manageable, and it will depend on the database and the indexing and how things are put onto the database as to how you can limit your search, but you could limit by age, sex, publication type. Sometimes if you're looking for, say, your efficacy data for your PBRA, your PSUR, you may limit it to clinical studies and certain other types because you don't want everything retrieved. You're only looking for a specific type of information to come back. Really, though, as we've seen, you need to, from a publication type, you shouldn't really be limiting that. You're interested in manuscripts, you're interested in posters, everything. You'd want to retrieve much more than you would for some of the other searches for different purposes. I think whatever you do, it's really important to ensure that you justify any limitations and that it's relevant to the product, relevant to the search that you're performing. And as long as you can do that, that is appropriate. As we said before, you need to capture all types of adverse events and situations where you might not have an adverse event, but you'd want to receive information in relation to these areas. Now, a lot of companies used to limit to English only. You shouldn't limit to English. There's no reason to do that. You need to have a good translation service in place so that you can translate the things that do come through in another language. And you shouldn't limit to humans as well. Whilst for ICSRs, yes, okay, you could argue you're only going to really want to see human data. However, you might have an emerging safety issue coming out, and you would want to be able to capture that through your literature search, so you shouldn't limit to humans either. Now, when looking at your date ranges, you need to ensure you cover an entire period. And, on the face of it, you say, well, you're going Friday to Friday, it should be fine. However, you need to ensure that if you are doing Friday to Friday, it should be that 9 o'clock, say Friday morning, you run your search, but it goes from 9 o'clock to that Friday, from 9 o'clock Friday to 8:59 the next Friday, and you don't miss any time frame, and that you've covered that whole week. And again, the database providers will help you to set that up and ensure that you're not missing any kind of time in that period. You should also ensure that you retrieve all your records in that period, not just those initially entered or published, and you will see this come through. So you might see that on Medline, you've done a search for a certain week, and you'll see a whole load of articles come up, and they're from, say, 1988 or 1987, and it could be they've just added those articles onto the database at that time. But because of the search that you've got, you'll see that it's pulled up, and that's appropriate. That is what you need to do. You just need to understand that, and then suddenly not think, oh, I've got a new safety issue here, or there's suddenly new information that's been published on something that was known about, because that's not the case. It's just that they've archived that, put it onto the database, and that's why it's showing up at that time. So looking at the outputs themselves, they do vary depending on what you request in the database, etc. So, you could get the abstract, but you do need to look at least the abstract to review the information. You shouldn't really base your assessment on just the title. You should look at the abstract, and that should help you to decide whether this is something that you would need to retrieve the full article for or not. And when we look at the review overall, I think what is important, and I think the review is one of those things that you have to do on a regular basis to really get that understanding of what would be considered, new safety information. ICSRs are probably a little easier, but you need to really kind of do that on a regular basis to get a feel for what you're looking for. It is quite hard, I think, to actually specifically train people. It's something that does come with a lot of practice. But saying that, certainly from Module 6, you need to have the reviewer trained to identify the articles of relevance, and that's related to cases, that will be spontaneous cases, and those related to non-interventional studies. You need one case per single identifiable patient. And again, there's been a lot of discussion about if you have a summary article, how do you deal with it? If you have aggregate data, how do you deal with that? And certainly with the EMA coming on board, they have published guidelines that do help in the assessment and understanding of how those cases should, if even they should, be put onto the database. And I'll come on to that when I talk about the EMA. You also need to look at relevant safety information for your product. And I think the ICSR is a little bit easier because you can pick up a case. You can see quite clearly when there's a case. But when you're looking for other relevant safety information normally for your PSUR, that can be a little bit more difficult because you tend to want to pull everything out, but then you're not really looking for everything. You're looking for relevant, new, important safety information, and you have to bear that in mind because otherwise it would be unmanageable. So you're looking for new information, something that's going to be of interest where you haven't seen it before, or something that's going to help you understand a risk a little bit better. So all articles likely to be relevant to PV should be obtained. So you're often going to have the abstract. You need to look at the abstract, make that decision. Is this either an ICSR or is this something that's going to be relevant for my PSUR, or is it a signal or, emerging safety issue? And then you need to ensure you retrieve that article in a time frame that's appropriate for what you're looking at it for. So if it's an emerging safety issue, you need to get that, very, very quickly, so that you can deal with it, look at it, assess it, and then ensure that process is adhered to very rapidly. So what can you exclude for cases? So when you're looking at cases and to put onto your database, there are various things that you can use. You can use, or there are various things that have now been specified where there'd been a lot of discussion before. Where you have multiple products mentioned in an article, you should only include those ICSRs where the author has stated that there's a causal relationship. So before, what you might have is a case where a patient took 10 different medications and experienced an event, and your product was a concomitant medication, and you'd end up putting it on the database. Really, you shouldn't be doing that. You should only be putting on those articles where the author has said, yes, I think it's down to taking X drug and that drug is yours. Okay. You can also exclude ICSRs where your ownership can be excluded. So that could be either through the product name or the active substance name or the form itself. So if you've only got oral and this is IV, you can say, well, that's not my product, or the batch number. Also based on the country of origin, and this also used to create a lot of discussion because people would say, well, yeah, somebody could have taken it on holiday with them and it could be our drug. But it's very clear now, if you've never supplied that product or placed it on the marketplace in that country, you don't have to put it up onto your database unless it's a travel medicine. So if you have an anti-malarial and there's a case from Africa and you can't exclude it based on the brand name, except then you would have to consider this for putting onto your database as your drug. You don't have to put it on, though, if it's never been commercialized. You could have had a marketing authorization, but never commercialized in that country. And if you have a National Competent Authority database within the EU analysis, you don't need to put that on either. Okay. So, Rosie, I can see you've got a question there. Is it okay if I come back to that? Or I'll see if I can answer that. What actions require where a causal relation? So if a causal relationship is not specified, you would not put that on, because what you're looking for here is when somebody's published an article and they're referring to your drug or your product as being the reason for that event occurring. Otherwise, you will end up with information on your database that will dilute everything else that's on your database and will affect your stats, etc. So you're really looking for those articles where there is considered to be a causal relationship by the reporter. So hopefully that's answered your question there. You don't need to put on cases from interventional studies, and you don't need to put on cases where it comes from an aggregated data source for patients. So that's quite clear as well. Looking at the PBRA and the PSUR, so here you're looking for new and significant safety findings, and this is where it's important. It's new and significant. It's not every single safety finding, because you'll find loads and you'll end up with hundreds of articles to summarize in your PSUR that won't give you any additional safety information for your product, really. It is a wider search than your cases, and you need to look at studies as well as pregnancy outcomes, your subpopulations. So we put pediatric populations here, lack of efficacy, important non-clinical safety results. So it is a much wider kind of remit here. You need to have a broader thinking behind what you're looking for. If anything, from a safety perspective, that's relevant for your product, that's new, though, and significant. Now, the one thing that I would say, though, is that with the PBRA, you do need to look at your important risks and missing information. And there may be certain articles that you wouldn't necessarily say is new and significant safety information, but it might be relevant for your risks, your important risks, so your important potential or identified risks, where perhaps it's helping with the characterization. So it's important to bear that in mind when you are doing your literature review and thinking, well, actually, yes, respiratory depression is an important identified risk with my product. And this is talking about a study in this patient population with maybe COPD, something like that. And actually, whilst we know that respiratory depression is related to the product, this is giving me a bit more information. So whilst it's not new and significant, it is significant, really, and new and significant for that risk. So it's slightly different. And I think you do need to bear that in mind. And you need to consider your missing information, and that's where your subpopulations will come through. So something maybe on hepatic, on renal, on pregnancy, pediatric, etc., and pick that out so that you can summarize that appropriately. You should consider class searches as well, where you have products with significant class effects to make sure you are capturing everything that's of relevance for that product for the PBRA. I mean, this is different to the ICSRs, remember. And then, as we touched on previously, the new information on efficacy and effectiveness, which is a much more targeted, though, search. But what will often happen is Med Affairs will do that search and then come back to you and say, here's my output. There might be some safety-related information here. And really, we should be doing that as well with the safety searches and saying, well, there's something here on benefit and use in our approved indications that might be of relevance for the efficacy and effects of the benefit section, and we should forward that on to our Med Affairs colleagues or whoever is writing that section, but that doesn't always happen. So if you do contract out, the responsibility of the search, as with all of these things, remains with the marketing authorization holder, and you just need to ensure that everything is documented appropriately, and you should really perform an audit or ensure that the service provider can meet the needs that are required. And your day zero always will stay as the first person, so it will be your service provider when they either perform the search or receive the article in the same way as it would be for a company. So in the last few minutes, I just wanted to touch on European Medicines Agency. This is from the directive, and basically the EMA are meant to monitor the literature to avoid all of the duplicate cases that they were receiving, because everybody was doing the literature searching, and then anyone with that product, and if it didn't state your brand name and you couldn't exclude it, you'd have maybe 20 companies putting the same literature article onto the database. So to avoid that, they said, no, we're going to actually do literature searching, and we're going to make your life so much better. But I don't think it's quite worked that way yet. So as of the 1st of July, the top 50 substance groups had been reviewed, as in they'd started the literature searching process, the procedure for the top 50 substance groups. And then as of this month, it's gone to the top 400 substance groups. And I believe there are 300 medicinal products and 100 herbal medications. And what the EMA do is they search MBASE daily, and then they search EBSCO monthly. So these are more of the herbal type databases, and they're looking for cases that aren't in MBASE, basically. And they will then, amend or add to their list any cases that come up from there. What is interesting, though, is you can see very clearly the search parameters and the product search terms as well on the website. So if you go onto the EMA website and type in EMA, or if you go on to even Google and just do EMA literature monitoring, it comes up with a nice page that summarizes everything, and you can see the search terms there in the various documents, either for the search parameters or your product as well. And it gives you an idea then of kind of how you should be constructing your own search strings. There are two tracking sheets. One is the search results and one is the ICSRs, and these are available from the secure area of Eurovigilance website with a separate row for each record. And looking at the trackers, actually, or these, the spreadsheets, it gives you an idea of what you can use as well from a company perspective for tracking. So when you do have a case, then on the spreadsheet for the cases for the ICSRs, it's flagged as a C, and day zero is the date that the search was performed. But unfortunately, this hasn't been, the be-all and end-all that we expected it to be. There are issues because you do need to look at whether other databases need to be reviewed for your product. You need a process to review your website, the Eurovigilance, I should say, website daily, and you need to consider your local literature. Also, you need to consider special situations as well, so misuse, overdose, abuse, where you don't have a case, no adverse event, but you need to review them and capture them for your PSUR. So you'll need to kind of do that review anyway, but you'll need to pull out those articles separately. What you are meant to do is you're meant to download the spreadsheet, you don't resubmit your cases, and you add the case to your MAH safety database so that you can perform your other activities such as your signal detection and inclusion into PBRA as needed. if you identify an article that's not processed by the agency, you need to send to the service desk if it's in the list of publications that they are meant to be looking at. If it's from a publication that they don't look at, then you would just process it as you would normally do. And there are a couple of local requirements for Germany, Hungary and Spain. So if you have products in those countries, you do need to make sure that you're on top of what those requirements are. So unfortunately, whilst I think that it has been of some help, you do need to do in fact it's added to a lot of companies' workload, because you will download the ICSR spreadsheet and you will cross-check, but most companies will be looking at least 2 databases, in which case just looking at Embase for ICSRs, okay, fine. However, for significant or for new and significant safety information or information related to the risk, they're going to have to do their own searches anyway and just do that separately. So it hasn't really made it as efficient as we hoped it would do. So coming on to local literature, you do need to ensure there's a process for local literature review. And certainly where you've got publications that aren't covered by the European Medicines Agency or by the major safety databases that you're using for your own searches at a global level. And I mean, for the UK, it tends to be that most of the journals are covered unless there's a specialised journal in some way. But for a lot of the other countries, generally you'll know what are the main journals that aren't covered. Often, though, I would say go to your commercial colleagues and say, you know, what do you look at on a regular basis, or even MedInfo, and they can point you in the right direction, and you can then do a proper analysis of whether you need to look at that literature, or whether that's local literature you need to have a process for reviewing or not. And if you don't, that's fine, but you need to just justify as to why you don't need to look at that particular journal. So the last slide is on the quality aspects. Big focus, as we know, for the new legislation, which isn't that new anymore. It's kind of coming up to a couple of years now. So you do need to retain your records of how your search was constructed, what terms are you using, how are you retrieving records, and what databases or database are you using. You need to then state what dates your search was run, and you should really keep your assessment of the output for a specific time period, so you can show that you've looked through what you looked for, how your assessment was made, and what was picked out, and that should really be kept. You need a tracking system to ensure that, if you requested an article from an abstract, that you have received that in due time, and also if you've requested a translation as well, that you've received that in due time. Because if you're getting lots of articles coming through, lots of things that you're asking for, if you've only got 1 or 2, that's probably manageable, but more than that, you will need a system to actually manage those requests and make sure you're getting things back in due time. Now, there is a recommendation to perform quality control checks on the sample of literature reviews, and this is just to make sure that the right information is being picked out. So, I mean, this is something that would be good probably to add from a metrics perspective, where you're looking for, a certain percentage of articles retrieved would match with the person who's actually performing that QC check, but you'd need somebody who has experience in article review for that. So I'm going to stop there. I know we've covered cases, we've covered PSURs, what the EMA are doing, and the fact that it has still required us to go ahead and do our own literature searching, a little bit about the search terms. Haven't gone into huge depth on the actual search terms. It really will depend on your product and the areas that you're looking at and the databases that you're using, but the EMA website is a good place to start overall and work with your service provider. And we've talked a little bit about quality aspects as well, and that's becoming more and more important. You've got to make sure that, one, you know what you're doing the search for, you justify whatever you don't do or don't include, and that you review it on a regular basis to make sure it's pulling through exactly what you would expect it to pull through. So I'm going to stop there. I know I'm 5 minutes over, so apologies for that, but are there any questions? So if contracted out, is there a need to validate search strings? When you say validate search strings, I would always check that it's retrieving whatever you have put in as a search string is retrieving what you expect it to retrieve. The way to do that is to, just trying to think now how we would do that. I mean, we would have a search string, we would run it, and we would just check the output, to be honest. I don't know if there's a formal validation as such. Regarding the selection of aggregate reporting, should we be only selecting RCT, systematic studies, or can we also select articles which reviews less number of patients? So it looks like, certainly from an ICSR perspective, you wouldn't be expected to put on interventional studies. For systematic reviews, you wouldn't be either, but you would want to have a mechanism for reviewing those for your PBRA and for your PSUR for signal detection or emerging safety information. I hope that answers your question. Thanks. I assume that's yes. Okay, any more questions? Nope. Okay, I think I'll hand back then to Michelle.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Seema. Fantastic webinar. And thank you everyone for listening in. We've got a recording of the webinar which we'll be sending out either later today or tomorrow. And thank you for your time. Goodbye.
Very much. Bye-bye.